And it's BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Thursday. It is time for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. I am your host, Black Box Ned. And because today is Thursday, you can say hello to the Fox. So, in this episode, I'm going to be talking about several different subjects because True Crime Talk Radio is a segment that I do on Black Box Online Radio, where anything in the true crime world, anything under the sun or in the darkness is fair game, multiple subjects within a single episode. And last year on the channel, I did an interview with Michael P. Burns, who is the author of The Flat Tire Murders, and it talked about several different stories from the state of Florida. And I received a comment on that episode recently, giving a shout out to Tom Baker, who requested an episode on Oba Chandler. And this week on Black Box Online Radio, I'm really trying to get to more of your requested topics. I'm really trying to get to the stories that you guys want to hear about on Zodiac Monday, talking about the Zodiac Killer, Ripper Wednesday, talking about Jack the Ripper, and Cooper Friday, talking about D.B. Cooper. But here on True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, I'm going to start with the story of Oba Chandler. But it's a different type of case because it's possible that Oba Chandler wasn't actually a serial killer. He was a man from Ohio who committed his crimes in the Tampa area of Florida. And Casbah is here. He says, "Good morning, Sir Ned." Good morning to you too, Casbah. You can have a cheers from the Fox. And Oba Chandler was someone who went on to commit a very bizarre type of triple homicide. A mother and her two daughters were on vacation from Ohio, and what they think he did was that he looked at the license plate that was on their car, and he saw that they were from Ohio and he was from Ohio, and that he just started talking to them, making some small talk and chit chat, and he agreed to take them out on a boat ride. And then on the boat, he murdered them, put duct tape over their mouths, tied them to cinder blocks, and threw them into the water. 3 people died in this incident. But I was just watching the show The Investigators, which was a court TV program from, well, several years ago, and they were talking about psychological profiling and stating that it really doesn't seem like this individual committed his first crime with such a calculating and methodical triple homicide. And a lot of the time, I disagree with psychological profilers. I talk about it all the time. I'm not a psychologist or anything, but sometimes people will say things about true crime stories, and you just think, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense at all. But in this case, I agree. I really don't think that this guy, Oba Chandler, committed his first murder, which was a triple homicide, killing 3 people and tying them to cinder blocks and throwing them in the water. And Ray Grant is here. He says, "Don't tell me I'm first in the chat room." Well, Casbah may have beaten you to it. And Lacey is here. He says, "Good morning, Ned and everyone." You once said that you were writing a book about Ted Bundy, or you had the plan to write a book about Ted Bundy. And I will be discussing him later in this episode because I think that a discussion on Florida serial killers would be incomplete without mentioning Ted Bundy to a certain extent. But Oba Chandler was actually tracked down for a very particular reason. And I've talked about this on Zodiac. And he told the story of Oba Chandler in a way that was really interesting because Oba Chandler was interacting with his family of 3. And they had some directions that were found in their car on some type of Days Inn motel brochure, or a brochure that was from the Days Inn. I shouldn't mistake that. And the handwriting was extremely bizarre. It didn't look like anything that belonged to the other people, to those 3 people, the mother and the 2 daughters. There was a letter Y that was drawn, and it just kind of drags halfway across the page. I'm exaggerating, but he had a very peculiar way of writing the letter Y, very odd letter shapes. And they recognized that this was not the handwriting of the family, so they thought that this was a set of directions that was written by someone who was either responsible for the crime or knew who was responsible for the crime, like perhaps in the setup. So they took that handwriting sample and they put it on a billboard, and they just said, "Do you recognize this handwriting? Do you know who wrote these directions? This person might have been responsible for a triple homicide." And sure enough, somebody recognized it because it was extremely unique handwriting. And they're like, "Yeah, that guy was a handyman who used to work for me." And ultimately, that is how Oba Chandler was caught. And Adam was talking about this on Real Zodiac Killer Reveal because he was just asking the question, how likely is it that someone can be identified as being a murderer or a serial killer purely based on similarities in handwriting? And this might be an extreme story. This might be an extreme case. But, there, of course, is other evidence that they were able to put in play. Oba Chandler denied all of these things. and he talked about how he just was innocent. They got the wrong person, but at the same time, he didn't seem bothered by it at all. He was featured in this episode of The Investigators, and he is just sort of like, yeah, I wrote them the directions because they were going on my boat, being all gentle. The thing that serial killers and murderers do when they are just non-threatening, they put on the non-threatening facade, and he is a clear case of that. Absolutely no no recognition that he is in jail and going to be executed and all of that stuff. So that's a very bizarre and saddening story. But here's something that's also doesn't deal with psychological profiling very well. People have this concept in their minds that serial killers are sad, lonely men. Ray Grant talks about this all the time, right? That some people just think a serial killer has to be a sad, lonely man. Oba Chandler fathered 8 children, 8 children, and he was always going from woman to woman. He was a womanizer. It happens a lot. And serial killers are not always sad, lonely men. And it's not always just somebody who's married and living a double life. No, serial killers can be womanizers. Ray says, I will post a video today about the Riverside 2016 hoaxer. Stay tuned. Okay, Ray, I would definitely love to watch that one because we were discussing that one last time. If you want to pick up on that, I would love to know what you have to say. Always looking for different sides of the story. Jerome from the French Wrecking Crew is here. Hey, Jerome. Hey, Johnny. Hey, Jay. How's everybody doing? Welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. Now, there's another story from the Tampa area, and that is the case of Tony Abels. Tony Abels was a serial killer known as the Tampa Rat, and he's another clear example of somebody who didn't fit the mold of being a sad, lonely man because Tony Abels murdered his partners, murdered his girlfriends, and he was somebody who used different methods to commit these crimes. He committed a murder in the 1980s by strangling a girl, and sadly, this girl was from Riverside, California, relocated to Tampa, Florida. Riverside is just an unlucky place for so many people, sadly. Southern California has such bad luck. But yes, he strangled her in the 1980s. He also beat his girlfriend to death by throwing her down the stairs and stomping on her. And there was a documentary that was made about him on the Twisted Minds channel. I did a short episode once about Tony Abels, and they believe that one of the reasons why he was driven to kill, and ultimately he murdered 4 people, so unlike Oba Chandler, he would meet the definition of being a serial killer, but he murdered people because it started out with having a very bad relationship with his father. His father was abusive, and one day his mother just couldn't take it anymore. And she moved out of the house, and he was extremely devastated by this. Devastated to the point where he was just had an enormous psychological shift. Prior to that, they were just saying that, he was a nice, friendly kid who liked playing the violin. Then he goes on to become a serial killer who beats people to death. And this stuff with the parents really affects people. And it cannot be downplayed. It cannot be downplayed. Because with Oba Chandler, even though I suspect that he was a serial killer, I'm not 100% sure. They say that the single biggest driving factor for him to go on to become violent was he lost his father at a young age. His father passed away, and at the funeral, Oba Chandler actually jumped in the grave as they lowered the body down and they were putting dirt on top of the casket. He jumped on the grave and jumped on the coffin, the casket, and he just threw a temper tantrum, and he was just so upset because he lost his father, which, as a 10-year-old, that part I can empathize with. And we experience this a lot when we're discussing true crime cases. And I remember that it was Stephanie Harlow, the YouTuber whom I first heard this from, when she said that even though this person went on to do terrible things, part of you still feels something for that kid that's experiencing this terrible, terrible event. Andrew WVA is here. And Andrew, how's it going? My brother from West Virginia. He says he worked at a sub shop in Miami and had access to their delivery van. And Andrew, which serial killer would that be? And Scott Bobbitt is here. Scott, good morning. Anthony is here. Good morning, Anthony. How's everybody doing? Welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. So, these are stories of people who had these types of psychological issues that were created partly because of problems with their parents. But with the case of Tony Abels, it goes so far beyond that because, first, he's convicted of murder. Then he's sentenced to death. Then it was determined that perhaps he had psychological issues to the point where they thought that he had certain mental disabilities and it would be inappropriate to execute someone with these types of mental disabilities. That does not happen everywhere, mind you. I've gone through a lot of different stories here on Black Box Online Radio where the defense attorney is trying to push this message. They're trying to push this to the judge saying, my client's mentally ill, he shouldn't be executed. Sometimes they're still executed because some of it is just the lawyers working their magic and they're not necessarily presenting things in a way that is well honest what they truly believe. Instead, what they are doing is trying to promote this narrative that is just beneficial to their client. As somebody once told me about lawyers, they want to win. That's how the game is played, and we can get used to it. Cat Daddy Steve is here. He says, good morning, Ned. Good morning to you, too. And Kid Check the Rhyme says, hot, fresh cup of serial killer in the morning. Top of the morning, Ned. And you get a cheers from the Fox, Kid Check. And you, too, of course, Cat Daddy Steve. But now let's move to the story of Ted Bundy, because this is a big one. And I was just watching the Mind of a Monster documentary, which is available on YouTube here for free. And this particular episode, this documentary about Ted Bundy, discussed a lot about the Chi Omega murders. And those took place in the state of Florida. But to provide a little bit of an introductory note, this one really wanted to zone in on how, with Ted Bundy, there were warning signs. The stuff that I've discussed in previous episodes about Ted Bundy here on this channel were all about how, okay, he had this weird relationship with his parents, and his biological mother was pretending to be his sister for the longest part of his life, and then he learned that, oh, she's not my sister, she's actually my biological mother. And the Mind of a Monster documentary openly stated that his biological father was his grandfather, and there was some type of abuse that was going on in the household. So he has kind of an incestuous, not kind of, they claimed he had an incestuous relationship with his daughter. Terrible, terrible stuff. But that's what they were proposing, and all of these things would have caused Ted Bundy to just experience certain elements of psychological trauma. But I said they focused on the warning signs. They interviewed people who knew Ted Bundy while he was growing up, and they're just pointing out all of these examples on how and why he was showing signs of deviant behavior at a very young age. He would even take kids into the forest and tell them to disrobe and to take off their clothes, so on. I mean, this is just terrible, terrible stuff. And I'm just kind of sitting back watching this thinking, why didn't anybody put a stop to this? But I do have to bring up something that I've discussed on a previous episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, and it's an interview that was done by Patton Oswalt, who is the comedian and actor, but he's the husband of the late writer Michelle McNamara, and he just said Ted Bundy, it was a zilch. Everybody was like, oh, this guy was a smart legal mind and he had everything going for him, and how could he do these things? No, he was just yeah, he's a lawyer, big deal. He went to law school. He went to law school, not important. He was a loser. He was a murderer, terrible person. And yes, they really wanted to focus in on that because, like some of the people that I was talking about in this episode already, Oba Chandler just being interviewed in prison, and he's just sort of like, he's just kind of like bouncing along with it. Ted Bundy did that to the upteenth level. Because when he's conducting all of these interviews, he's always just laughing and smiling and just these light little giggles. Well, I have faith in the justice system. Silly things that you wouldn't necessarily expect from somebody who was not only on trial for murder, but facing the death penalty. And ultimately, Ted Bundy was executed. Casbah has something in the comments section. I think Andrew WVA was talking about Roberto Fernandes. Roberto Fernandes was a Brazilian serial killer who committed crimes in the USA. He murdered at least 3 women and did terrible things like he forced a woman's body into a suitcase and left her on the side of the road. And a lot of what was learned about Roberto Fernandes came post-mortem, and the connections that were made among these crimes were solved with DNA. But at that point, Roberto Fernandes had already gone to Brazil, back to his home country, and they tried to extradite him at one point, but Brazil refused to extradite him. Now, even though I'm not a lawyer, I've explored this subject somewhat on Black Box Online Radio, and as I understand, another nation is never required to turn over their citizens to the United States for extradition. Like if somebody committed a crime in the USA, but they're a citizen of Brazil and they entered Brazil legally, the Brazilian government is not forced to turn them over. But there are ways around this using things called like the Interpol Red Warrant. again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to just act like I know everything about it. But yeah, Brazil refused to turn over Roberto Fernandes. And ultimately, he died in a plane crash going from Brazil to Paraguay, or at the very least, he died in a plane crash in Paraguay. And then that was just another terrible story. They even exhumed his body from the grave, and they were just trying to see, did this really happen? This guy seems so twisted and sociopathic that he was perhaps someone who could have faked his own death. But according to DNA tests that were done from the body in the grave compared to Roberto Fernandez's DNA, it was him. Anthony says, I have been fascinated by your work and really enjoyed watching them. Oh, you're talking about Ray Grant, actually. Says, to Ray, just on a side note, have you re-uploaded your videos? Oh, yeah, Ray Grant made a very large video series starting last year in 2023. And those were really good, but Ray is going to be dropping a new video about the 2016 hoaxer. In the spring of 1967, 3 letters were mailed after the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. And this is again in Riverside, California, very unlucky town. And somebody claimed that he was the author of those letters. And in 2021, Riverside went public and they just made some comments about them. Let's just leave it at that because I think Ray's going to share a lot of that stuff with us later on. Casbah says, I'm a former Miami-Dade Reserve Sheriff. Oh, is that right, Casbah? Well, if you have any firsthand insights about these stories of Florida serial killers, you can put them in the chat. We would love to hear them. All right, so Ted Bundy is growing up with all of these terrible warning signs, and he develops a relationship with somebody named Stephanie Brooks. That's not her real name. And they have a falling out. She dumps him. He wins her back, and then he dumps her just to get his revenge. And I always wondered, why wasn't that enough? Dude, you won. You got the girl back, and then you're like, screw you, get out of my life. I turned the tables on you. The reason why is because Ted Bundy had so many other budding psychological elements. Ted Bundy might have even been a born psychopath, someone who was actually born with irregularities in his neurotransmitters. And I don't know why, but I always watch content about true crime and serial killers and unsolved mysteries. But lately, the documentaries and the podcasts and the YouTube videos that I've been following are all just saying some people are just evil. Some people are just evil. Some people are just evil. And in this Mind of the Monster documentary, I mean, they were just sort of saying the same stuff. Ted Bundy was just evil. What they really mean is some people have neurotransmitter issues where their brains cause excitement from acting in a murderous and physically violent way. It fuels their excitement, it makes them feel elated, and they enjoy it in a very bizarre way that we don't completely understand 100%. I don't understand it 100%. But I just really don't like these oversimplifications of saying they're just evil. They're just evil. No, there can be a little bit more to the story than that. There can be other ways for us to understand a situation. And sometimes you can use that in terms of practicality. Like when you're just dealing with stuff in your personal life, you can say, some people are just jerks. Yeah, you can say that stuff, but when you're actually trying to understand human behavior, would you ever just stop it at that? Just some people are just jerks. Some people are just evil. Some people just kill people. No, that's not acceptable. Cat Daddy Steve says 20 watching and only 6 thumbs up. All right, well, everybody, you can listen to Cat Daddy Steve. Hit the like button if you want to follow along with these episodes. True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, coming to you every Tuesday and Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the summer. And on Monday, Zodiac Monday, Ripper Wednesday, Cooper Friday. Lots of content here on Black Box Online Radio, and I invite you to check out some of the older episodes. And as always, please drop something in the chat. And if you're listening to this at a future date, you can put something in the comments section down below. Oh, yes, and Anthony says that he's looking forward to the new video from Ray Grant, and I'm going to as well, because I like to listen to different forms of commentary about unsolved mysteries, the Zodiac Killer, D.B. Cooper, Jack the Ripper. You guys know I follow those very closely. And sometimes you want to just hear different perspectives, and we're talking about this on the panel discussion show. We're trying to launch a regular panel discussion show on the French Wrecking Crew, which is run by Jerome, and hopefully it'll be coming out on a weekly basis or a bi-weekly basis. And there are at least 3 episodes that are out right now. And I invite you just to subscribe to the French Wrecking Crew as well. But Ted Bundy is arrested. He goes to jail. He breaks out of jail. The famous story where he's studying in the law library because he says he wants to be his own lawyer, sneaks out a window, and he's ultimately caught, apprehended. He's caught later on. He goes back to jail. He escapes from prison a second time, sneaks out through a ceiling vent. And they actually interviewed somebody who worked in the prison, and Ted Bundy made a comment to the guy telling him he was going to escape. He's going to say, if I lost weight, I could sneak out that ceiling vent. I could crawl into the vent, into the air duct, and I could break out of prison. And the guy thought, by his own admission, this is what he said in the documentary, I thought he was just nuts. I didn't think he was really going to do it. Well, he did. And then Ted Bundy went on to commit the Chi Omega murders in the state of Florida, perhaps his most famous crime. Terrible, terrible situation. Think about how many people could have been saved. And in the Chi Omega murders, Ted Bundy bit the victims. And this is one of the things that they pointed out, that prior to this, he really didn't leave a lot of physical evidence behind when he was committing his crimes. And one of the reasons why Ted Bundy was caught before is because of, he had a seat taken out of his car, he had a kill kit, but he didn't leave a lot of physical evidence. But with the Chi Omega murders, he bit the victims, and they contacted a forensic dentist, which is sometimes called a forensic odontologist, and he did some bite mark comparisons and was just like, this is an absolute perfect match. And then ultimately, Ted Bundy was sentenced to death. And, I really do agree with Patton Oswalt about Ted Bundy being a zilch, because he really doesn't seem like someone who is an extraordinary mind in any way. The only reason people talk about this guy is because he was one of the first serial killers to be put under the microscope and thoroughly examined. Ted Bundy confessed to over 30 murders, but he is a suspect in 100 murders. And, part of me thinks he committed more crimes than 30. I highly doubt that he committed 100 people, but he's an example of a traveling serial killer. Not all serial killers stay in one place. Not all serial killers are the type that are just going to commit crimes even in the same way. Ted Bundy would be a very good example of that, because he definitely did not commit the crimes following the same pattern all the time, right? He would put a fake cast on his arm, and he would tell a woman that he needs help with something, and that he puts on this ruse to get her into a vulnerable place, and he would commit the crime with blunt force trauma. And one of the stories they told in the Mind of a Monster documentary was that he met a woman at a shopping mall, and he said, hey, I caught somebody trying to break in your car. I'm a police officer. And she's like, where's your badge? And he opened up a wallet and showed her his badge. And she's like, oh, okay, I guess this is real. He's like, hey, would you like to fill out a report? And she's like, yeah. So she's just walking with him, and ultimately she survived, of course, because she was able to participate in the documentary. But he's putting on these different types of ruses. Then the Chi Omega murders happen, where he breaks into a sorority house and he's attacking people indoors, almost committing a Richard Speck-like massacre, although Richard Speck's massacre was much larger. And Anthony says, I've hit the thumbs up button and I would like to use emojis, but I'm on my laptop and I don't think I can do that. Hey, it's all good, Anthony. But he says, I would like to know your opinion of the death penalty. It has not been legal in Australia since the 1960s. Anthony, I am mostly opposed to the death penalty. For the longest time, I supported it. For the longest time, I was just like, some people are too dangerous to exist, even in the prison populations. And one of the serial killers that I've talked about on Black Box Online Radio is an individual named Harry Hodges. Sometimes he's referred to as the Screaming Strangler. And he committed 3 murders in the 80s and 90s. Don't quote me on that, though. It's been a while since I've done that episode. And in that case, at one point, he used to have 5 prison guards escort him at all times whenever he was being moved out of the cell. And one of them had to be holding a video camera so they could show that the force they were using on him was justified. And I'm just sort of like, some people just are extremely dangerous. But because I did the episode about him on Black Box Online Radio, I learned that the reason why he was acting that way was not simply because he wanted to inflict pain on other people. He was dealing with some very extreme mental illnesses. And the reason why he gets this nickname, the Screaming Strangler, is because he would just start screaming randomly at times. He had to be restrained to a more or less a prison bed, and he even cut off his own penis once and held it up for the guards. And his defense attorney, to her credit, I think this is someone who actually believes what she was saying, is just like, hey, all right, I know this guy did some terrible stuff, but he's extremely mentally ill. He belongs in a psych ward, not just in prison. But Anthony, I ultimately had a reversal once when I heard the story from a man who was wrongfully executed in Rhode Island in the 1800s. And the state of Rhode Island just said, one is more than enough. We don't want anybody to be wrongfully executed. So they outlawed the death penalty. And Anthony says, what is the law in West Virginia? Eden, it's so weird, Anthony. I can just rattle off that stuff about Rhode Island off the top of my head. What is the law in West Virginia? I don't know. I don't think we have the death penalty. Don't quote me on that. I should know about my home state. No, Rhode Island, that just comes to mind so quickly. Florida, they're all about the death penalty. California, not so much. California outlawed the death penalty, then they brought it back, and then this is the famous thing with the Manson family. The members of the Manson family who committed those murders were sentenced to death. Then California retracted and repealed the death penalty, so their sentences were commuted to life in prison, but then they brought the death penalty back. However, the people who were sentenced to had their sentences commuted during that intermediate phase were still allowed to stay under that previous law. So they were all under life in prison. But here's another issue about why I would be opposed to the death penalty, and it comes to us from someone named William Hirons. And he was convicted for one of the lipstick murders in, oh goodness, I mean, I can't even remember the exact year of that, but it was like he spent 65 years in prison, maybe more than 65 years in prison. I think at one point he was the longest serving inmate in the entire country. And William Hirons openly said he didn't do it. He may have actually committed a murder of somebody else, and they tried to blame him for this lipstick murder. That was why they singled him out, but he's just like, he didn't do it. And he accepted a deal for life in prison over the death penalty. And they were like, why would you admit to something that you didn't do? And what he said was, I knew that if I kept going in with the courts, I would be sentenced to death. I would be convicted for this and sentenced to death. Therefore, if I stayed, in prison, if I stayed alive, I would have a chance to defend myself. I would have a chance to clear my name. People should not be wrongfully executed. And I completely understand the animosity that people have toward these types of serial killers. And I used to be in that particular situation. After Ted Bundy's execution, people were jumping up and down and cheering, and his body was put into a coffin and put inside a hearse, and the hearse drove by, and they're just, shouting and waving and just celebrating this. An enormous crowd was gathered for Ted Bundy's execution outside of the prison, but someone can be wrongfully executed. And that just shouldn't take place. And at this point, though, I would like to open up the floor to True Crime Talk. You guys can put anything you want in the section, and it's down below. But another clear case of someone who claims that they were wrongfully convicted, and it was someone named Chester Weger, who allegedly committed the Starved Rock murders. He maintained his innocence the entire time, spent 59 years in prison for the crimes, and he was ultimately let out on parole, but he just wanted his sentence in conviction vacated. He just said he didn't do it. And he's a very clear example of someone who didn't always tell the truth, because at the time of the murders, he said that he was going to a barber shop to get a haircut. Then he said he was sitting in a room at his employer's place of employment writing letters. Then he said that he was shaving at the time in the bathroom. He's telling different variants of the story. And ultimately, he was convicted for murdering 3 women, the Starved Rock murders, maintained his innocence the entire time. So part of me wants to just be like, the death penalty should exist. You take a life, you give your own. And people were ultimately saying this in a lot of the things that I was watching today, because even with Roberto Fernandes, one of the officers who was on the case said, okay, he died in a plane crash. We didn't have the pleasure of taking his mugshot, and it gives me some pleasure, though, just to know that he's dead. And I guess I'm at the point in life when I don't think like that. I don't really get pleasure out of knowing that any serial killer is dead, or any pleasure to know that somebody's been executed. And, it's just, people deserve to be convicted for crimes. People deserve to be punished. And one point where I do agree with Stephen Kay, one of the prosecutors in the Manson family case, is that Stephen Kay said the primary focus of the prison system is not rehabilitation, it's punishment. And for people who do have extreme mental health issues like Henry Hodges, maybe they do belong in the psych ward as opposed to a different form of prison incarceration. Ray Grant says, "Let me know if you want to do a Bundy video or live stream." Yeah, Ray, I would love to. I would love to do something like that. I'm going to be restarting the interview series. I did a couple interviews recently, one with Richard Patterson about his book, Jack the Ripper, the works of Francis Thompson. And Francis Thompson is, of course, his Jack the Ripper suspect. Also did an interview recently with Pat Boland, talking all about D.B. Cooper. But I would love to just bring back the interview series and put some things out for True Crime Talk Radio here. And yes, with Ted Bundy, though, I mean, people just explore this story in countless ways. Ray Grant actually recommended a book to me once called The Phantom Prince, and I did the interview with Michael P. Burns, who was incorporating elements of Ted Bundy's story into his book, The Flat Tire Murders. But yeah, I would love to do a Bundy video. Anthony says, "I agree with you about the death penalty. Also, I've just seen a video and a question to put the Democratic nominee for president 1988, Michael Dukakis. He was asked on CNN." Let me read that again, Anthony. I was reading too fast. Sorry. "I have just seen a video of a question put to the Democratic nominee for president, Michael Dukakis. And it is, what would he do if his wife was raped and murdered? He was against the death penalty." Well, I would definitely want that person convicted. I probably wouldn't feel too bad if that person was executed and they got the right person. But a lot of the things we have to remember is when you're creating laws and policies, you need to separate your individual feelings from the law itself. And it was actually when I was watching the show The People's Court once, the courtroom show, and it was not in the Wapner era. I grew up in the Ed Koch era before Judge Millian, and Judge Ed Koch clearly said, "You don't get to do what you want. You have to do what the law says." So ultimately, that's where I would stand. It has to be about the principle, it has to be about the law, and not letting individual feelings cloud my judgment. But yes, if someone actually did that, I probably wouldn't feel too bad, and I might even enjoy it. Being honest, being honest. Ray Grant says, "On a lighter note, have you seen that a guy who does videos on the last meals of death row inmates, he actually shops for the groceries and cooks the meals?" No, I haven't. Can I be very honest with you guys? Of course I can. It's True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. I have spent way too much time thinking about what would I want for my last meal on death row before I was executed. And I'm like, why? Why do I always think about this? I have no idea why. I don't want to kill anyone. I don't want to commit any crime that would be worthy of being put on death row. But part of me is just going to be like, I want pancakes with strawberries, whipped cream, and chocolate shavings, because it's from the movie The Life of David Gale. And I've talked about this a little bit before on the show, that I incorporate things from like movies and books into my choices in life. And like the stupid Zodiac killer, see, everybody does this. Everybody does this when you like make decisions that aren't necessarily your own or your original ones, but it has some type of meaning to you. There's a very big reason in the movie The Life of David Gale why Kevin Spacey's character wants to have pancakes with whipped cream, strawberries, and chocolate shavings. I thought about that a lot, but I also was thinking once I wanted a pizza that was half cheese, half mixed vegetables with extra olives, and kung pao tofu with a side of rice. I was a vegetarian for 6 years. Don't judge me. Oh, I eat meat now, though. And I mean, I crave steak every single day. It's almost disturbing. And Ray Grant says Bundy didn't leave any forensics. Oh, you say Bundy didn't leave any forensics. So Ray, this is why we're going to have to do the live stream. Do you dispute the forensic odontology? Do you dispute the bite marks that were left after the Chi Omega massacre? Because John Oliver, of all people, on Last Week Tonight, did a whole episode on forensic science. And I used to watch his show every week. I haven't seen it in about 4 years. But his focus was all on how bite mark evidence is not reliable. This whole thing about how the forensic dentist and the odontology all matched up, he's like, it's not reliable. It's not reliable. And they gave all of these examples about how people were wrongfully convicted because of forensic odontology. I would hear somebody out on that. And with this story, I want some. Why am I drawing a blank on this? Was this the Carolyn Eaton looking at her X-rays and comparing them to the X-rays of this body that they found in Arizona, saying, yes, this is the missing person? This is this person's daughter. And yes, sorry, your daughter's been murdered. Then years later, the daughter actually showed up. She came home. Hi, mom and dad. Sorry, I've been away for 10 years. And they're like, what? The forensic dentist told us you were dead. No? Yeah. I think that was the Valentine Sally story. But Valentine Sally was a real girl that was murdered in 1982, not by the Zodiac killer, but Arthur Lee Allen is a suspect in that, the 1982 murder of Carolyn Eaton. Andrew says, we don't always know if they got the right person. DNA has exonerated several people on death row. Absolutely. And not only that, people who are in life or serving life in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Did you guys ever see the video of the person who was convicted for a crime? Or, he's I don't want to misstate the story because I only know a little bit about it. But he's on trial for this crime. They're accusing him of something horrible. But he was actually at a Dodgers game, a baseball game, and the evidence that cleared him was that they were filming an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm at the exact date and time that the crime took place, and he was in the background, like he's behind Larry David, and then he's just like, absolutely, this guy wasn't the criminal. He was just watching a baseball game. And they're like, nope, nope, you're a murderer. I mean, okay, and here's something else, Andrew, about people getting cleared. You also have stories like Jens Suring and Elizabeth Haysom. And Jens Suring was somebody who spent 30 years in prison for murdering his girlfriend's parents, the parents of Elizabeth Haysom. And he confessed to it. And he claimed his innocence after that. He immediately retracted the confession and he said he was innocent the whole time. And people are just like, well, why on earth would you confess to murdering your girlfriend's parents if you didn't do it? Well, he was in the United States on a diplomatic passport because his father was a diplomat and he thought that he had diplomatic immunity. His girlfriend had actually arranged for the murder of her parents. Terrible, terrible thing to do. And, apparently 2 other people committed the murder. But Jens Suring was her boyfriend at the time, and he claimed that he was actually just at the movie theater. I know he said he was watching Rocky Horror Picture Show, but it was a double feature. And ultimately, sometimes people will admit to things that they didn't do. They will make confessions to things that they didn't do. And Jerome knows the story of Brendan Dassey better than anyone. Brendan Dassey from Making a Murderer, Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey, about how someone can be duped into making a confession if someone doesn't understand what's going on. All of these things can take place. So just because people think they understand the situation does not mean that someone is actually guilty, and people are exonerated all the time. And Anthony says, there's a very small budget allocated for a last meal. No Michelin-starred restaurant meals. Yeah, I saw that on Ripley's Believe It or Not once, where some guy requested steak and lobster for his last meal, and he was unable to receive it because he was they just said the prison's kitchen was unable to do so. But I've definitely seen in other death row stories that people have been able to get steak and lobster, because I always think about it. It was on Ripley's Believe It or Not, where the guy that wanted steak and lobster couldn't have it, but the guy who requested a jar of pickles, he could have that. He ate all the pickles and drank all the pickle juice. And I know what Anthony's talking about. It's much cheaper to get a jar of pickles than steak and lobster. And we have Anthony with another one who says, have you also stayed up at night worrying that your last meal bites could exonerate you? That your last meal bites? How would that exonerate me? Not quite sure. I think that I would probably, I would not be somebody like Ted Bundy who would refuse my last meal, just like, I'm not hungry, I'm going to die. No, I would probably be like, I eat pancakes for last time. Oh my gosh, this is good. Yeah, just whatever. What do you got to do? Electric chair, gas chamber, firing squad. Yeah, it's been a long time since someone was executed from firing squad, but they made a movie about that called The Firing Squad. I did a YouTube short on it once. Cat Daddy Steve says, psych test. Steak, 1 rare, 2 medium, well done. I eat my steak rare, actually, Cat Daddy Steve, almost always. Believe it or not, I grew up in a house where my father ate well done steak and my mother ate it medium rare. And I ate steak well done my whole childhood. I just wanted to be like Dad. I kind of arbitrarily chose that. Well, not arbitrarily. I thought that it was bleeding when I was a kid. You cut it. Why is the meat bleeding if it's supposed to be cooked? So I ate well done steak until I was 17. And I remember this very clearly, though, when we went to a steakhouse once and my mom was like, try it medium rare. Now, and I preferred it that way. Then I just started going, pushing the ethical limits, going to like blue and lavender, all of that stuff, extremely rare. Anthony says, has anyone ever requested to eat their victim? I don't know about that, about requesting to eat their victim. I'm sure Jeffrey Dahmer was thinking about that before he was murdered in prison. But contrary to that one YouTube video, Jeffrey Dahmer did not get his last meal in a formal execution. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed in prison. I responded once to a YouTube video on the Zodiac Killer News Report where they were just talking about the last meals of convicted criminals. And one of them was an individual named Michael Campbell, who isn't even on death row. And they had the name wrong. Michael Campbell is a sex offender from Missouri. He is a sex offender from Missouri. He might even be out of prison right now, but, just people make up so much crap and they put it out on the internet. Cat Daddy Steve says, what about the mass school shooter witnessed by dozens of students, teachers on video, and no death penalty for this guy? It's like mass shooters. That challenges a lot of what I said about the death penalty. People like Nicholas Cruz, yes, I think he deserves the death penalty, but on principle, I might be opposed to it. When I say he deserves the death penalty, somebody who set this whole thing up, Nicholas Cruz might be a very clear example of societal suicide. Somebody who either wanted to get caught so he could be put in jail so he would end his normal life outside of prison, knowing he was going to get life in prison. James Holmes would be a more extreme example of this. Nicholas Cruz committed the Parkland shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, and he tried to escape by disguising himself as one of the victims, but he was easily apprehended. It's like they commit that shooting on one day. What is it, like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Columbine lasted longer than that, I think. Maybe that was 19 minutes. That's why Jodi Picoult wrote a novel based on the story. And then they go to jail for life. You could just be like, put an end to this person, execute them, and let's move on. But it's, I'm still kind of against the death penalty on principle. Anthony says, my mother always overcooked steak. I never liked it until I had it medium rare at a high-quality restaurant. Now I'm hooked. It really isn't the same making it at home. Like when I go to a high-quality restaurant, you don't need steak sauce. You don't need A1. You don't need butter. You don't need anything. It just tastes amazing. Anthony says, I think even with mass killers that state-sanctioned murder is wrong. Oh, and we have a comment from Captain Jenks who says, what do you think about the Idaho killer, Ned? And his name is Daniel Koberger, right? I am going to be very honest with you. This is one story that I have never truly explored. I was following a lot of other true crime cases during the Idaho quadruple homicide. His name is Daniel Koberger, right? I've seen a little bit of the news footage when, much like Ted Bundy, much like Oba Chandler, much like a bunch of these other criminals, he's just kind of like bouncing around like Chris Watts, and he is just being a little bit silly about this, or they're trying to show some very, very lighthearted sides of him. And I'm just like, what? Oh, Brian Koberger is his name. Brian Koberger. Yes, as you see, I'm not familiar with the story at all, so I can't comment too much. I just think that the media is showing a lot of lighthearted sides of him, and I don't know why. Now, this brings up something that I talk about a lot on Black Box Online Radio, because I mentioned lots of serial killers, like Tony Abels, the Tampa Rat, Ted Bundy was the Lady Killer, and a lot of them have nicknames. Is that an ethical thing to do? When I started making YouTube shorts this week, I began with the story of the underwear bomber, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, and the shoe bomber, Richard Reed. And with these cases of terrorists and even mass shooters, I don't think giving them a nickname is glorifying them in any particular way. The underwear bomber, that's not trying to make the guy look cool. If anything, that makes him look stupid, which he was. And the shoe bomber, yeah, the guy that tried to set his shoes on fire and cause an explosion, I don't care what happens to him. Both of those guys are serving life in prison now, multiple life sentences. Now, I'm just going to share something with you guys about Umar Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber, not a serial killer, and not falling in line with everything in this episode. He is an attempted terrorist. I was reading about him, and I was going through some articles, And it's talking all about, oh, he's an Islamic terrorist. He was radicalized when he was studying Arabic in Yemen. And I'm just like, no, no, I don't accept it. I'm just reading, you know, article after article. I'm waiting for it. I'm waiting for it. People don't just go to school and then come home as a terrorist. Something else is going on. Then I'm like, aha, there it is. Sexual dysfunction. Why do people commit these types of crimes? Sexual dysfunction, sexual frustration. He was writing in his journals that he was very frustrated that he had sexual urges and impulses that he couldn't control, and he was trying to look for some type of deviation from that in his life. In short, he was a sexual mess, like so many of these other people, like Ted Bundy, like Tony Abels, like Old Dysfunction. All right, with the examples that I just listed off, Ted Bundy, absolutely. I confess I don't know things inside and out about Oba Chandler and Nicholas Cruz, but with another mass shooter, James Holmes, absolutely, absolutely. I think he committed the Aurora shooting because of sexual frustration, the lack of intimacy in his life, not being able to understand other people, feeling rejected by society, all of that. And some people commit crimes because they want to get revenge on society. Other people look for a sense of belonging, like the underwear bomber, Umar Abdul Muttalib. Now we have Anthony says serial killers sure love nicknames as long as they can choose them. The Zodiac Killer was a massive piece of garbage. BTK was a massive piece of garbage. That's where I completely agree with the First Degree podcast. I talk about this all the time. I heard their episode back in 2020 when they said there's a special place in hell for people who give themselves their own serial killer nickname, like the Zodiac, like BTK, like the Chinese Zodiac Killer, although I don't really know if that guy killed anyone. Just sort of a troll and a hoaxer. And we have Yokoso says some of the names are majestic though. Yeah. This is what somebody was talking about once when I did the short episode on Michael Bray, the cowboy killer. See, you can remember the cowboy killer. That's mostly why I use serial killer nicknames here on this channel. But just it helps me remember them. But they're almost like that kind of is glorifying the killer in some way. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But other people like Tony Abels, the Tampa Rat, I don't think he wants that nickname. Captain Jenks says Koberger was a PhD student. Seems like he had an obsession with BTK and other serial killers. I definitely have a true crime obsession. I don't want to kill anyone, and I do it more for the empathetic reasons. And I am kind of so far gone in this world that I don't think there's anything that would truly pull me out of it because I was reading Paul Begg's book, Jack the Ripper: The Facts, and he had a bookshelf in his home, and he counted how many books he had about Jack the Ripper, and it totaled 85. I've just scratched the surface with Jack the Ripper, and I don't think I'm ever going to get out because I'm genuinely curious about this. Yes, of course, we want the answers. And I just want to see some way, somehow, maybe somebody has connected the dots. Maybe I will connect the dots in a particular way. I haven't read every book about the Zodiac Killer, and there are a few that I'm going to devote Zodiac Monday to. But I've read quite a lot of them. Perhaps I should know better about the Ripper. Just simply reading a bunch of books will not give you the answers. Anthony says, also called genocide. That's responding to somebody in the chat. Anthony says, even most psychopaths are not killers. More likely to be a CEO, politician, or a surgeon. Well, Anthony, in the book The Sociopath Next Door by Dr. Martha Stout, she even talks about this, about how not all sociopaths and psychopaths are killers. She told the story of a guy that she calls Stamp Man in the book, and he would break into post offices and just steal stamps. And then he would just sit back and wait for the police cars to come and watch people conducting the investigation. He's not killing anyone. He's just stealing stamps to be annoying because he's in control of the situation. But yes, apparently he was a clinical psychopath. Captain Jenks says, do you have a favorite Zodiac book, Ned? Not just one. Not just one. And I really do appreciate Tom Voigt's Zodiac Just the Facts, though. Zodiac Killer Just the Facts, excuse me. It's the type version of the police reports, but so valuable. And Cat Daddy Steve says Koberger was effed up and left his K-bar knife sheath at the scene with a drop of his blood on it, along with phone tower pings near the scene, ring cams of his car near the scene. He's toast. As I said, I didn't even know the guy's first name. I got that one wrong. I'm going to have to do an episode for you guys on the Idaho murders once I become more familiar with the subject. Maybe we can do that one next week. And this episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning is winding down. Anybody can put your final things in the chat. I would love to read them. And other than that, I will be seeing you guys tomorrow for Cooper Friday, talking all about D.B. Cooper. And thank you to everybody who has tuned in here and has shared stuff about these different types of stories. True Crime Talk Radio is meant to be a discussion show where we can talk about any subject under the sun or in the darkness. Andrew WVA says there's a new Zodiac doc coming on Netflix in late October. Bring it on. And I'm going to read up on that because at this point, I'm not just like, oh, wow, that's cool. I'm like, wait, what's the angle? Which way is this going? Is it going to be about a suspect? Is it going to be about a different type of aspect? Is it going to be about forensics? It really depends on how it's done. Because as we've seen from J. Foy, sometimes people are proposing suspects and they don't do the best presentations. As we've seen from the case breakers, sometimes people propose suspects and they don't have the best evidence. So I won't hold my breath too much. And Steve says, I'd like to see a good movie called SOZ, Son of Zodiac, where the killer takes on the original Zodiac killer's persona as his son. You got to write the script. You write the script and we'll put it into motion. Cat Daddy Steve, amazing. All right, everybody, have a good morning. All right, you can say goodbye to the Fox one more time. And everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you for tuning into True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And I'll see you next time, okay? One more. Until next time.